Today's class is entitled, What If You Don't Speak Your Ancestors' Native Language? Foreign Language Resources. Our presenter is James Tanner. He is an accomplished researcher and has a vast knowledge of available records and how to access and use those records. We appreciate the time he has taken to prepare this presentation and his willingness to teach us ways to expand our research efforts. We'll now turn the time over to James.
As title says, we're going to talk about what happens if you don't speak your native language. And we'll get right into it to see what's going on here with languages. I kind of caution people. A lot of times when I talk to people who are beginning their research, they will come in and they'll say, oh, I want to find my great-great-grandmother. She was born in Germany, or she was born in Switzerland, or she was born someplace else. And my answer is, how much genealogy have you done? And how much research? And, well, I'm just getting started. Well, that's really not a very good idea to start learning how to do genealogical research by jumping back and trying to learn it in German. I guess if you speak German, that's another question I would always ask is, well, do you speak German or French or Swiss or any of the other languages in Europe? And, you know, if they don't speak those languages and don't have that language ability, then learning genealogy research and language at the same time is a pretty formidable challenge. And additionally, when you're doing research in genealogy, it's never a good idea to jump back in time. It's when you look at a fan chart, for example, the fan chart view of family search, it's really tempting to jump back to one of those blank spaces and start to say, well, I'm going to find that grandparent in that blank spot. And unfortunately, usually what happens is that those blank spots are there because people have spent years or a considerable time trying to find that individual. Now, it may be that no one's ever done any work on your family tree and your parents came from Germany and you don't have any other choice. But there are always exceptions to every rule and every consideration. But first of all, it's just there is a learning curve. And one of the things that you realize if you continue to do research long enough and you go back in time far enough, you'll discover that you'll encounter people who speak a different language. It doesn't matter whether they all speak English or they all speak whatever language you start with. As you go back in time, language changes and it changes forward in time. So language is constantly changing. And if you were to talk to your great-great-great-grandparents, you probably would have a lot of difficulty understanding them. And it would be very unlikely that you would sound the same, regardless of where they came from. I studied linguistics at the University of Utah, and that was basically what we studied was language change over time. So that's what we do. And I also, part of my degree was in the history of the English language. So here we're going back. Most of the people that you run into, almost inevitably going back in time, are going to be immigrants. You're always going to find an immigrant if you live in America. If you don't live in America, you may find immigrants anyway, because immigrants and people have tendency to cross international boundaries between countries. And so it's very possible if you go back far enough, you'll find the language changes. So those are all issues. And so we need to know what to do when we get into that situation. There are strategies for finding the immigrant, and there are ways of dealing with doing research in another language. So languages and handwritten scripts become the most difficult hurdles for genealogists to overcome. It's just a matter of the way that things work. Even if you have an ability to learn languages easily, as some people do, and some people pick up multiple languages, and that's very helpful, and that's one of the things that's helpful. But there's very few people that pick up multiple old handwriting scripts without doing some rather serious research and serious effort at reading the language. even if it's not that old, sometimes reading handwriting that's been written very, let's just say, bad handwriting is it can become extremely difficult. Sometimes I've seen people write with their script handwriting, their cursive handwriting, where they don't make enough height in the letters and it looks like just one long scribble line. So, there's a lot of challenges going back like this, but we'll learn some ways to get about it. And just so first, some kind of benchmarks, so ways you can understand what happened in the past. Middle English was spoken from around 1150 AD to about 1450 AD. In Europe, primarily, by the time you get back into the 1500s or the 16th century, you're probably going to encounter a lot of foreign language because you're going to run into the fact that church records and many legal records and everything else are written either entirely in Latin or a mixture of language and Latin, and that makes reading those rather difficult. And what we see over on the slides on the left-hand side is an example of Middle English. And the text is readable, but the words, unless you are very familiar with reading Middle English, is rather difficult to read. And incidentally, as we do genealogical research in Europe, and primarily thinking of Europe and all the countries that were derived from Europe and are recording genealogical information, the time frame here gets you back into times when recording information about common people was uncommon. There are not a lot of documents that can tell you who your people are when you get back to this point in time. And so subsequently, you'll run out of documents before you run out of an ability to read the language. There are other benchmarks. This is German, if you're interested in jumping back into German clear back. And this is called Old High German. And it was spoken, it's Althochdeutsch, and it is the earliest stage of the German language, conventionally covering from about 750 AD to 1050 AD. And you can see the change in the writing. And it would be hard. If you understand Latin, you'll start to pick up Latin words, but some of the German words are very hard to read if there's German mixed in. And my caution here is don't bite off more than you can chew. And if you go back far enough on any one of your branches of your research, the original records will be looking like this. Now, if you go to and you see pedigrees that go back, clear back in time, we have the old one I've talked about a number of times, going back to Adam. But the question here is, did you actually do any research in doing that? It's not uncommon for me to find, for example, someone who has Charlemagne in their ancestry. My question to them is, what do you know about Charlemagne? How many wives did he have? How many children did he have? And most of the time, it's just simply a traditional thing that someone's written out all this long back ancestry. And I guess the question I would always ask them is, what language did Charlemagne speak? And can you read that language? And so there's other questions that indicate the degree of what we're talking about as being kind of a limit. Now, here's where we get into solving the problem. And this is how we learned and how we can go back and do research. And I'll probably repeat this a couple of times. When we do not speak the language, we don't need to do genealogical research, which is historical research. We don't have to speak the language and be able to converse. All we need to do is learn those terms and those words which appear in the records that we're researching. And that is a finite number, a very focused and limited, usually a very focused and limited number of characters. The exception, of course, is in probate files, old probate files, and some land records, because in those, the language and the that's used in those in deeds and all those kinds of older records may include a lot more vocabulary. But there are dictionaries, and that's one way that we can find and work our way backwards. It does take quite a bit of effort and time, and it is one of the things that we end up doing, generally speaking, among genealogists, is becoming very familiar with doing research in a particular country or using a particular language. And then it becomes difficult for us to break out of that. So people who start out doing research in their Danish or Swedish ancestors may end up doing Swedish or Danish records for the rest of their lives, because switching back to doing English research is going to require learning a whole new set of records and a whole new set of words and vocabulary and everything else. So that's one reason. And we reflect that at the BYU Family History Library, because we have people who specialize in individual languages. In other words, they are available to help people with the different languages. And so on our website, if you go to the virtual help desk, you'll find on that link that goes to the virtual help desk a link that also gives you a schedule of the people who are available, missionaries who are available with each of the languages that are spoken. That doesn't mean we can't help you with other languages, but we do have people who are not just able to read the languages, but are conversant in the languages. They can talk to people in those particular languages. So those are the ones that we've identified. And if you run into an old alphabet that doesn't look familiar at all, then you can look at the time frame and the place where that is and start doing some research, and you will eventually understand that there are these alphabet lists, and there's plenty of them. If you look for language alphabet lists on Google, you'll find hundreds or thousands of pages of these transcriptions of how the alphabet looks in script in various different time periods and different languages. So one good way to start is to look for books that teach old handwriting. And we'll get into that. There are online sources for doing this, but it's always nice to have this book in front of you that gives you all of these different pages, so you can have that to the side of you. And if you get to something you can't read, you can go look through the book and see if you can match the text and see what letters those are. There are a lot of different types of books and in different languages and these are just examples. But as I've mentioned here on the slide, early American handwriting is really English handwriting. I mean, from England, because that's primarily the influence that came to America. And the English script, the way they were writing at that time, at the early times in America, was mirrored in Europe. So learning early American handwriting helps you get back out of the country to your ancestors who immigrated in the times in the past, but it also automatically gets you prepared to move into England or any of some of the other countries in Europe, because by the time you've worked through your ancestors' handwriting, you probably have a way to a methodology to learn how to read all the handwriting. Google searches can help you identify the type of handwriting used in a document. It's a little bit of detective work, and you have to compare it a little bit. No, a little bit wasn't a good limiter there. You have to do a considerable effort of comparing sometimes to determine exactly what language it was. And if you look here at the Old Norse alphabet, you'll see that there are quite a few letters that are not in our English language, the common English, Latin-based English language that we have. And basically what this means for the way you're searching or researching in these languages is simple. All of those extra characters are alphabetical. And if they do an alphabetical list of names in those languages, then all those characters are going to affect the order of the way they're alphabetized. So I think that's a little kind of an interesting concept to realize, but it's the same way in when I was learning Spanish. We learned that ñes and double L's, the LY and the other extra letters that are in Spanish affected the way you found those letters in a dictionary. And online, they're going to be the same. If you do searches and you simply put in the English equivalent of these characters, you may or may not be able to find the entries that you're looking for. And so this gives you another level of challenge to understand to what extent are the entries in this particular database transcribed into to leave out all of these extra characters, or to what extent are those characters present. And it may seem obvious, but if you go to the country where this particular language was spoken in Scandinavia, the records are going to be organized using all these letters as part of the alphabet. And the entries in the archives are going to reflect this form of alphabet. So that's important thing to understand. Now, as we get into this, remember that you probably have relatives in your ancestral country or countries. It's possible that your entire line came to America, but it's not, or whatever country they came to. But it's also possible that people were left behind who were relatives in Europe or in South America or wherever else that your family came from. And so when you are doing research, you should take advantage of that and become involved on an international basis in genealogy. And you can do that with DNA tests. You can do that by having a family tree on a website like MyHeritage that has millions and millions of people on their family tree in Europe. And those are kind of advantages that you can use. And when you're in that situation, you probably will find, if you realize it, that programs like MyHeritage will automatically match your family tree to people in all the countries where they have millions of people over in Europe. And there are well over 100 million users on MyHeritage, for example, and they're spread millions of them in each of the countries in Europe. And it's not uncommon to find people on MyHeritage who are your relatives who still live in the country that your ancestors came from. So you'll have relatives. And if you do a DNA test, you get DNA tests verifying that the fact that these people are your relatives, because if they have a DNA test and you do, and you match to some extent, or whatever the extent is, depending on your relationship, then you've already determined that. And they're in the country and they speak the language and they know where the records are located. And many times the family trees that I connect with in the countries of Europe are much more meticulously documented and meticulously created, and are great assistance in adding and finding connections and finding the information you need about an ancestor. So don't give up the fact that you have the ability to get into this type of program like MyHeritage that can give you that kind of connection in those countries. It's nice to have a DNA test in one of the countries like in the United States, but you should ask yourself, what is your ultimate goal in taking a DNA test? Are you wanting to connect with people only in the United States or only in English-speaking countries? Or do you want to branch out and actually come up with relatives in other countries where they don't speak English? So this is kind of a way of looking at how research would progress if you were confronted with the language issue. I can't express the importance of understanding that there's a difference between learning the language for travel and conversation and learning a language to do genealogical research. There are, I don't know, quite a few, more than a few, different programs that are now mostly online and used to be just sold in a box, but now you have to either go online or subscribe or whatever to get into most of the programs. But they're language learning programs, and they will teach you the basics of learning the language. But I can attest to you, after learning Spanish in Latin America, by living in Latin America for years, and then basically learning it through school, and then getting into genealogy, but it was a decided challenge at first, even though I spoke Spanish very, very well and could converse and talk to people. But when I got into doing research, I had to learn all the vocabulary of all the things that I needed to know to do research in Spanish. But what I'm saying is that you can forego the original part. Learning the conversational language is not necessary for doing research in the language. It helps, and sometimes it helps if you have to talk to people. But basically, if you're looking at records, there is a limited amount of vocabulary that you're going to see, and if there's a word once in a while that you don't know, there are dictionaries. And so beginning that process may seem quite formidable, but it is doable. And it's something that you have to go through, even if you spoke the language. Just like if you now speak English and you're learning how to do genealogy, you're also aware that there's lots of terms and lots of things about doing genealogical research that, even if I talk about them in plain English, are not things that you will immediately understand. Now, there's another great tool out there, and it's been around for a long time. These are not brand new innovations. These are things that have been used previous to any computerized anything computer, and they are genealogical word lists. And in this case, we're talking about the Family Research Wiki, the FamilySearch.org Research Wiki. And on this website, there are a number of these, and I'll show you the list. Here's all of the word lists and other kinds of lists that are available on the Research Wiki by language. And so if you're starting to do research in any one of these languages, it would be extremely helpful, sort of a leg up and getting going, to go to the words list, because here you have not an expansive dictionary, but you have a very limited dictionary, but very focused on just the things you need to know to do genealogical research. And so looking for these word lists on the Research Wiki. Now, this isn't the only place that that word lists exist, but it is one of the few places where there's this many in one website. And so you can find other websites that assist you in doing research and list off the names and the immediate translations of different words. But even if you can get involved in the language itself, you still are confronted by learning to read the script. Here's how I think that it helps to do it. And this is exactly what I've done over the years to learn the different scripts. Nobody's really automatically born with all this information. And so we have to go through this learning process. And what I've done is make sure that I work back chronologically, incrementally, meaning I'm not going to jump back 500 years or 1,000 years and try to start redoing research. I work back learning by reading letters that were written in the early 1900s. That's where I learned how to read a lot of my script. I inherited a huge amount of information from one of my great-grandmothers, and part of that was letters, lots and lots of letters. And by reading through those for the genealogical information that was in all those letters, it helped me to learn how to read cursive in a lot of different forms from a lot of different people writing. And then as I went further and further back in time, that same talent that I'd acquired, the same ability that I'd acquired to read the cursive in the 1900s helped me read the cursive in the 1800s. Now, a lot of times I would pick up a document and I would look at it and I would go, I can't see how this works. I have no idea what this is. And I can remember it was kind of the introduction to that was trying to read wills, because all of a sudden here's a lot of different vocabulary, a lot of words that I was not familiar with. Only one advantage I had was that as an attorney, as a now retired attorney, but back then as an attorney, I had a pretty good idea of what it said. So it wasn't like I was hitting it cold, and especially with deeds and other legal documents, all of that was decidedly better because I knew what the vocabulary would be in English, and I assumed that some of the terms or most of the terms that I was seeing in this unrecognizable script were simply written like they were written as of the things that I already knew. So that was helpful. But in addition to that, I developed a methodology. And what I would do is I would stare at it for 15, 20, 30 minutes and see if there were any of the letters that I recognized. And if I had an alphabet on the side, I would try to see if I could figure out what some of the letters are. But I wouldn't keep doing that for very long. And I wouldn't spend that more than about half an hour or an hour on that. And then the next day I would put it down. And the next day I would come back and look at it again. And this time I might identify a few more letters, and I might even see a word or two that I understood. And then I would go back, and of course I'm using dictionaries, and I'm using even dictionaries of old legal terms and things like that, things that may, or even if you were an attorney today, you would not necessarily be familiar with all of these old legal terms. So by doing that day after day, after about a week or so, it would just seem like words would start popping out. And after more than a few days, once you had some words for context, then all of a sudden things began to work. But it was a process. And it wasn't like I was spending 12 hours staring at it, because what I learned is that your mind will then not see it anymore. There's kind of a common thing that happens in any type of creative work where you can't see your mistakes. You can't see what you don't want or can't understand. And so when you go away from it and come back to it periodically, looking at the document over and over and over again, even if it's just from learning a language or whatever, then that's the process where you can start to see the things that are there, and all of a sudden it begins to make sense. And by the end of the term, there may be the time of, let's say, a week or 10 days, or sometimes longer, much longer. The record would be almost fully transcribed. Now, handwriting issues and the fact that some words were just simply could not read some words, and we could not guess what they were. I could not guess what they were. Then that's always a problem. But this way of looking at the process and spending the time to come back, instead of trying to do it all at once, is actually the way that your mind becomes accustomed. And that every time you come back after the break of a day or so, then your mind is ready to see different things. And you're not just blocking out the stuff that you don't understand. So that's how you kind of get through trying to read these. Now, there are formal places to learn about script, and it'll take you through classes and teach you how to do it. And one of the most used out there is the Brigham Young University script tutorial. And they do English, German, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, Latin, French, and Italian, and go through old documents. And so you could choose one of these that's close or related or uses the same types of scripts as another country. And going through these documents will help you to read the language. And they are a structured way to work your way through and learn how to read the language. There's another one that's English handwriting online from 1500 to 1700. Now you say, well, I'm not trying to learn English. I'm trying to learn German, or I'm trying to learn French or whatever. Well, to some extent, there's an overlap, but it would be helpful from the standpoint of beginning to learn about the languages and about the different scripts that were being used to look at some examples. Because basically learning Old English handwriting isn't going to help you in Germany or the German predecessor countries going back to the Holy Roman Empire. Their language and scripts were quite different. But learning a German script, for example, will certainly help you with Old Scandinavian script until you get so far back in time that you're kind of losing all of the connection to the rest of Europe and getting into the runic script very, very early on. But as I said a few minutes ago, most of us are never going to get back that far in the lines that we have, because we're going to run out of documents long before we run out of the ability to read the documents. Where it becomes hard, and this is where it can be a challenge, is, for example, if you're doing research in Spain and Italy. Spain and Italy have church records that go back into the 1300s. And so you're definitely going to be faced with different scripts and even different languages, and end up with the majority of what you're looking at in Latin. The study of these old languages these old scripts, the script writing is called paleography. And so if you go out and search for paleography, and you will find, like, this British National Archives tutorial, and it will take you to learn the handwriting in documents in English between 1500 and 1800. And most of these are free. You will find websites that have courses where they're trying to get some money out of the courses. But there's basically a lot of very good information out there on how to learn and how to get your way through all of these. We also have a marvelous tool here with about 100 different languages called Google Translate. And I would suggest that you learn immediately, if you're going to have to deal with any kind of language challenge, you immediately learn how to use Google Translate. It's very simple. You put the English or whatever language you want on one side and then translate it into whatever other language that you want on the other side. So here you can see the words for each of those common genealogical terms, and some of them might be almost recognizable, but a lot of them probably are not looking like anything that you would even be able to guess was what it is in English. So understanding that there are language families and that languages have relationships, that some are more closely related than others. For example, because I speak Spanish very fluently and read Spanish and have a lot of experience with Spanish, I can carry on a sort of a conversation with somebody who speaks Portuguese and who also has some background in listening to Spanish. So back and forth between the two, we can sort of talk to each other. That's because Portuguese and Spanish are related languages. They're called Romance languages because they came from a language that was spoken in that part of Europe anciently and has developed out into these various other languages. So the Romance languages are like French and Spanish and Italian and Romanian and some of the other countries that speak similar languages. And so moving from one of those languages to another one is less challenging. It's not easier, it's not a good word to use ever, but it's less challenging than going to a language that's totally not in the same language family. And a language in Europe for that, it would be an example of that, is Hungarian and Finnish, both of which are not languages that have any familial relationship with any of the other languages in Europe. Most of the European languages are what are called Indo-European languages, and the Indo-European languages and Finnish and Hungarian are not Indo-European languages. So everything about them is foreign, and there's no what they call cognates, words that look and sound the same in the same language, in a language. So learning those languages is much more difficult directly from English as it is. Now, a lot of people rank languages and they say, well, this language is really difficult. And when I was going to school, they'd all say, well, Spanish is really an easy language. You don't want to take German. German's really a hard language. Well, usually that was based not on the difficulty of learning to speak the language, but it was on the perceived difficulty, primarily because in German, you had to learn a different alphabet. You had to learn what's called black letter German. And that was always something that put people off. But going and learning German was no different. And in fact, except for some differences in a lot of differences in the endings and the way the words put together and the order of the words, German is easier to speak for English, and from German to English and English to German, than going into Spanish. Spanish it sounds surprisingly easy to learn, and most of us come up with a few Spanish words, but believe me, once you get into Spanish, you don't sound like you speak Spanish to the people who speak Spanish till you have a way of getting past that. So it's not that quite the same in German. If you watch old movies and you watch about spies and things, you'll realize that in the military and wars and that a lot of people were able to take the parts of either English speakers from Germany or German speakers from English speakers and get away without being detected. It would be very much more difficult to do that in Spain. If you didn't speak Spanish, if you can't, it would be very difficult for you to do that. Let's just say that's the kind of level of difficulty. You could go out now and look for tutorials. And there are some amazing books out there on almost every the country of the world has at least some books on how to do real research and how to find your ancestors in that particular country. And if it's not a book, it's a website. And if it's not a website, it's a blog. And if it's not a blog, there's just other resources out there. And you should take advantage of those resources. This book is a fundamental book for learning Swedish research. It's step by step and takes you through all of the information you need to know. And my wife does Swedish research. Her family she's been interested in came from Sweden. She does almost all her research in Swedish and has for years and years, and she still uses this book. It's still sitting, basically a few feet away and occasionally needs to be referred to. So there are some wonderful helps and resources to use that'll take us into a different level. Another thing that is very, very helpful are partial translations. I would call them targeted translations. In this case, for instance, back again to the Family Search Research Wiki, you have Denmark parish register headings. And so this page is a screenshot of part of the page, but it's a very long page and has lots and lots of examples. And so what you have in the first example is what it is in Danish, and then what it is in English, the same thing. So the first set of bars up there with all the information in it are in Danish, and then the second set are in English, and then the first set's in Danish and second set, and it goes through year by year, showing different examples of the different parish register headings. Not all of the parish registers in Denmark or some of the other countries are uniformly the same. They have sometimes different entries. And I think Scandinavian countries are sort of noted for the fact that the headings on their entries and their parish registers are not just like one word that says born, died, whatever. They have tendency to go on and explain in detail exactly what they're looking for. And so sometimes you need a little bit of help. Like the first one there, to understand, it says where born, and it says rurally record the village, parish, civil district name, or farm or house if given. In a city, the city and the parish name, if more than one parish, and always the street and house number. So that was the instructions that were given, and that's what it says in the Danish with the instructions to enter that information. Now, when you have this translation, obviously, you may have to refer back to it, but you can then take the information and understand what it is you're looking at. So these are invaluable. Another way to do this is to go out and just look for research. Do some searching for transcriptions or translations. This has been very helpful in reading old wills, because I will put in a place and the year, and meaning fairly specific place and year, and then I'll say translations of wills from German to English, and you will find somebody who online has translated a will. And what that does, of course, is because a lot of wills and are consistently the same. So now you have a whole example of a translated will, and it tells you exactly which areas of the will and the language that you need to understand. And it also helps because the handwriting may be very difficult to translate. And if it's transcribed, meaning they've typed it out, using a typewriter or computer, then you have a clear text view of what the document contains in addition, which also helps you to learn the script. So now we have an example of more than a few words, and we have enough of the information that we can actually use that transcribed document to advance our understanding and learn more about the language, and actually do some research into documents that we perhaps thought were going to be nearly impossible. So look for the translations. Now, a transcription means that they just copy the characters straight across. A translation is turning it into a different language. Now, if you don't speak German or whatever language, and you can't find an English translation, maybe it would be helpful to translate it into Spanish or something else that you might have some background in. So think kind of globally and think about how it might help you to get the language to the language that you're trying to translate. I spent a considerable amount of time translating a language that was not a written language. It was a totally oral language. It's Shoshone Indian, American Indian, or Native American Indian Shoshone language. And I spent a couple of years learning Shoshone and learning to translate from the spoken language. First of all, we had to transcribe it, and that we did in phonetics. And then when we had the phonetics, we translated it into English. So it's an interesting process. Now, sometimes when you're faced with this whole prospect of having to be confronted with whatever language, then you think, well, let's run out and hire a professional to do this. Now, the thing that I would point out is that expect to pay professional level fees. This is Genealogy, and it is an ancestry company. It's headquartered here in Salt Lake City. That's one of the places. And then they have office people all over the country and in Europe. Now, basically, you can look down at this and see for 40 hours of research, the pricing starts as low as, they say, $6,000. So you can expect to pay professional level fees for research at a professional level. So there's some very specific things. I've worked off and on with people from pro-genealogists over the years, and they hire some extremely competent genealogists. But it's not an inexpensive way to go. It may be a good motivator to think that if somebody's going to charge that much, you might as well spend the time to learn enough to start doing the research yourself. Another thing that comes up is, what about traveling to the places where your ancestors lived? It seems like regularly people that I know are telling me, well, I'm going to go visit the homeland where my family came from. I've got a friend that's on his way to France, and I've got others that tell me they're on the way to other countries where their ancestors lived. And we're going to do that for genealogical research. Well, there's a couple of things that you're going to find out. When you get over there, it's not as easy as walking in to a library and picking up a book. Most of the archives that you would encounter over in Europe are going to have some rather stringent entry requirements, and access to the records may not be either easy or available for a comparative time. My experience with archives is that you're basically going to be spending a lot of time, weeks, if not months, in a place before you can do some significant amount of research. Now, you may be able to prepare. So what I say is that travel is fun and can be educational, but you need a lot of preparation and time to do research, and especially if you don't speak the language. So it may be more advantageous to contact people in the country who do the research and have them help you. Obviously, when you're working with what I call contractors, people who are you're employing to do work for you, you have to go through the whole process of vetting contractors and making sure the person that you're going to hire and pay is going to actually do the work. And I continually run into people who say, well, my family spent a lot of money hiring a researcher in England, and they brought all this work back, and they have all this work that they've done with England. And I guess my question always is, well, have you worked through to see if it's right? And sometimes the answer to that is yes, it was excellently done, and it's all supported by all the documents, and everything's there to look at. And sometimes it's the opposite. So the old adage was, when I was getting my car repaired at various car repair places, my idea was I would never take my car in to a car repair place and ask them what was wrong with it. I always wanted to know exactly what was wrong with the car before I took it in to get it fixed, so that nobody could tell me that I needed 6 extra things that I knew I didn't need. And the same caution comes with being involved with people who are doing genealogical research in other countries, or here in the United States even. In order to have a really helpful experience, you have to have a level of sophistication that says that you understand what you're getting and whether or not it's believable. Now, here's the other side of the coin. This is something that I hear about very frequently over the years. It's stopped being unusual a long, long time ago. And that is to have somebody say, when you go across the country, or you go over into Europe and you go into a big repository in Germany expecting to do some research, and they say, I'm sorry, the records aren't here. And you say, well, where can I go to get the records? And they say, well, you really need to go to the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, because they're the ones who came in and digitized all our records. And that may be filled in with Ancestry, or that may be filled in with MyHeritage today, or Find My Past, or some of the other programs. But they're no longer basically worried about having people come in and do research, because they've already allowed the people to come in and digitize the records. So before you go taking a trip off to Europe or wherever it is, if you just want to go to Europe and want to go to the places where your ancestors lived, that's great. Because I tried to do that this summer and ended up with COVID and came home and never did get to where my ancestors were born. But if you do that kind of thing, then you'll want to do it for that reason and not worry about all of the records and resources. You may want to visit some cemeteries and do some things that are possible without doing a tremendous amount of research if you can identify the places. But you certainly want to be prepared if you go overseas. So that is kind of the whole thing. So keep learning, and some things take an appreciable amount of time. There's no free ticket to doing genealogical research.